Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a deeply analytical, completely objective look at the United States defense system. We're going to map out the sheer mechanics of the American war machine, strictly following the data, historical records, and declassified documents to see exactly how this whole thing functions, layer by layer.
Okay, let's dive into this. To even wrap our heads around the scale of what we're talking about here, we really have to start with the sheer volume of money involved. If you take the military budgets of the major global powers, we're talking Russia, China, India, and several others, and you combine them all into one massive pile, the United States still spends more. The US literally outspends the next 10 countries combined. It's a jaw-dropping scale that completely redefines how we have to look at global defense.
So, to make sense of a system this massive, we're going to peel the onion layer by layer. First, we'll look at the Pentagon's massive budget. Second, the defense contractor monopoly. Third, weapons as geopolitical currency. And finally, unchecked covert intelligence.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Pentagon's massive budget.
The data makes one thing absolutely clear right out of the gate. The U.S. military acts as a global policeman, maintaining a sprawling, worldwide presence. And, as you might guess, that global footprint comes with an extraordinary price tag. The total budget for 2023 clocked in at a staggering $853 billion. To put that abstract number into some kind of relatable perspective for you, $853 billion is actually larger than the entire economy of Switzerland. Just let that sink in for a second.
Well, let's break down where all that money actually goes, because it's fascinating. The largest slice here, $352 billion, goes straight to operations and maintenance. This covers everything from training troops to running the roughly 1,250 U.S. military bases worldwide, and get this, about 800 of those are located abroad. Then we have $172 billion for personnel, paying over 3.4 million employees. There's also $140 billion dedicated to research and development for futuristic tech like AI and autonomous subs. And crucially, we see $167 billion earmarked for procurement, which is simply the purchasing of physical military hardware.
Now, looking at that massive $167 billion procurement slice, a logical question naturally comes up. Who actually builds all these weapons? Because, the Pentagon isn't exactly manufacturing F-35 fighter jets in the basement. It turns out, roughly 54% of this massive budget flows directly out of the government and into the hands of private for-profit corporations.
Which brings us to Section 2, the defense contractor monopoly.
When a system pushes this much public money into private hands, it inherently creates a setup for budget inflation. Tracking the data over the last few decades, a really startling trend emerges. The defense industry actually went through a massive consolidation. They transitioned from 51 competing prime contractors all the way down to a monopoly of just 5. The Big Five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, effectively own the space now. This means the Pentagon has practically zero alternative options when they need to buy hardware.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it demonstrates basic economics. Monopolies almost always lead to massive price gouging. Decades ago, back in the 90s, the Pentagon paid about $25,000 for a Stinger missile. Today, that exact same missile costs the taxpayer nearly $500,000. When there's only one shop in town, prices skyrocket. And honestly, audits routinely find absurd markups. Like the Pentagon once paid Boeing over $3,300 for a single ball bearing that they literally could have bought in their own warehouse for $15.
To ensure these budgets just keep growing, these corporations employ a very precise strategy of political engineering. It works like this. First, they spend millions lobbying lawmakers. Second, they intentionally spread their manufacturing operations across dozens of different political districts to create local jobs. Now, lawmakers, who obviously want to get reelected, become incredibly incentivized to secure even more defense spending, just to protect those jobs in their home states. It becomes this closed, continuous loop of spending that faces almost zero political pushback.
Let's move on to Section 3, weapons as geopolitical currency.
So, the American war machine doesn't just build weapons for its own use, it actively exports them to over 100 countries globally. But treating weapons as a highly profitable export product to make businessmen rich is definitely not a new phenomenon. In fact, as the 1934 book Merchants of Death noted, and this is a quote, "Arms makers engineer war scares to fear their neighbors and rivals so that they can sell more armaments." Ever since the Industrial Revolution, businessmen have realized that engineering weapons and selling them on the open market is a phenomenal way to get rich, even if it often ends up exacerbating global tensions in the process.
Today, of course, these sales have to go through government approval, and this brilliantly illustrates what the U.S. is actually trying to buy when it uses weapons as international currency. Based on our source analysis, the U.S. uses this lethal currency to purchase friendship, strengthen military alliances like NATO, counter geopolitical rivals, secure vital resources like oil, or even force regional stability by keeping preferred governments in power. However, the data clearly shows that this kind of leverage very often backfires. The U.S. sells weapons with strict conditions, like explicitly requiring that they not be used against civilians. Yet in cases like Saudi Arabia's campaign in Yemen or Israel's conflicts in Gaza, American weapons have been repeatedly used in ways that completely contradict those stated conditions. The intended leverage actually reverses. The buying nations realize the U.S. is basically locked into the alliance, which allows them to act independently of American demands. Which takes us to our fourth and final section, unchecked covert intelligence.
Now we're plunging into the darkest layer of the onion. Beyond the highly visible budget and those global exports lies a hidden apparatus that operates almost entirely beyond public scrutiny. This shadow system was actually born out of strict necessity during World War II, with the creation of the OSS, America's first centralized intelligence agency. While it was originally supposed to disband during peacetime, the Cold War sparked the creation of the CIA in 1947, and very quickly the agency's somewhat vague mandate of national security expanded into a decades-long spree of peacetime regime change. They orchestrated coups from Iran to Guatemala and eventually evolved into modern covert operations like the post-9/11 secret prisons. What's wild is that this massive expansion contrasts incredibly sharply with the original intent of its founders. President Harry Truman, the very man who signed the National Security Act that created the CIA, initially hesitated because he legitimately feared creating a secret political police force. He explicitly stated, "We don't want to risk having an American Gestapo." Years later, after witnessing the agency's unchecked power firsthand, Truman retroactively expressed deep, profound regret over its creation. And to really understand the terrifying scope of this unchecked power, we can just look at a declassified document from 1962 known as Operation Northwoods. The Joint Chiefs of Staff literally drafted a plan to stage fake terror attacks on American soil, and we're talking about bombing U.S. ships and hijacking civilian planes, just to blame it on Fidel Castro and justify a military invasion of Cuba. While President Kennedy ultimately rejected the plan, this historical record neutrally demonstrates the absolute extremes to which unelected officials were willing to go to achieve their geopolitical goals. That culture of operating completely outside the law continued right into the modern era. After 9/11, the CIA constructed a global network of secret prisons, known as black sites, to interrogate suspected terrorists without adhering to international law. According to subsequent investigations, an astounding 54 different nations were secretly complicit in this. They allowed the CIA to use their airspace or their territory to abduct, transport, and unfortunately torture 119 individuals.
So, the crucial point is, did any of it actually work? Did operating in the shadows and violating international norms keep people safe? Well, according to the official Senate report on the program, the answer is a definitive no. The investigation found that zero actionable intelligence was gained specifically from torture. Zero. Instead, the U.S. lost its moral high ground, handed a massive propaganda victory to its enemies, and completely tainted the legal trials of actual terror suspects, which ultimately denied victims' families true justice.
All of this brings us to the final overarching question of today's explainer. We've seen the massive budgets. We've looked at the corporate monopolies, the geopolitical weapons trade, and the unchecked covert intelligence networks. So we really have to ask ourselves, does outspending the rest of the world and operating in the shadows truly guarantee peace? Or does this self-sustaining system inherently risk endless global escalation? It is a deeply complex reality, hardwired right into the structure of the American state. And understanding these mechanics is absolutely the very first step toward answering that question. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you on the next one.